Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Caitlin Del Calo. I am Chief Strategy Advisor for Delaware State Housing Authority, and I am providing staffing support to the Community Focus Group Subcommittee, which is chaired by Rachel Stucker. We do have a quorum. We have 5 of our members present out of 9. So at this point, I will turn it over to our chair, Rachel.
Thank you, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. We're going to start. You should have all received the agenda. It's also for members of the public who might be watching. It's also posted on the Affordable Housing Production Task Force website. And so we're going to start with introductions. I'm very honored to be with you all and to be chairing this subcommittee. Excited for the work that we're going to do over these very brief next couple of months here. We've got 3 meetings to do some stuff. We're going to talk about timeline. We're going to talk about our charge today. But before we do that, we'll do some introductions. As Caitlin said, my name is Rachel Stucker. I'm the Director of Housing Alliance Delaware. And here in the room, in addition to Caitlin, is also someone else. I don't know how well you can see us in Zoom land. So Sarah, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll call on folks to introduce themselves who are online.
Hi everyone, Sarah Ryan. I work at Community Legal Aid.
Thank you, Sarah. Ed?
Hi, I'm Ed Gutze, father of a woman with Down syndrome, and I'm chair of the Housing Committee of the State Council for Persons with Disabilities. And
thank you, Ed. How about you, Lillian?
Lillian Harrison, president of Elevated Community Development Corporation, and a host of other things. I sit on several housing boards across the state.
Thank you, Lillian.
You're welcome.
Yep, and Portia.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Portia Harvey. I am Senior Program Manager at Catholic Charities. I manage the Basic Needs Program that provides homeless prevention and support to those who are actually experiencing homelessness.
Great, thank you, Portia. And Michelle, I know you are not a member of the subcommittee, but I'd love for you to introduce yourselves in case folks don't know you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Statham. I'm the supportive housing planner at DSHA.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here because I think and hope we're going to talk quite a bit about supportive housing in the subcommittee. So glad to have you. If it's all right with everyone, I want to keep moving along in the agenda. Number 2 on the agenda is review of definitions. For those of us here, these might seem really simple, but I thought it was really important to make sure that as we're doing this work together over the next couple of months, that we have some shared and common definitions. It doesn't mean that we're always going to mean the same thing when we say them, but at least this can help frame our conversations about these topics and issues. So I'm going to share some very basic definitions of affordable housing, subsidized housing, and supportive housing. And then I'm going to hand it over to Caitlin to talk more about the task force and the charge of this committee. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Are they in presentation mode? Because we can't tell on our end.
They are not. They are embedded.
No. Okay, let me try this again. There we go.
All right. You go ahead, Caitlin. Okay. If you can. Okay. So generally speaking, when people say affordable housing, they tend to, as many of you probably know, can mean a lot of different things. So I just want to talk about those things. Generally speaking, when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about a housing unit that is affordable to people that are at or below the area median income. So households, affordable housing, meaning people at or below the median income of a particular area, whether we're talking about the state of Delaware, Kent County in particular, whatever geography we're talking about, that folks can afford that, meaning that they're paying no more than 30% of their income towards their housing costs. As a general term, that might mean that if you're a higher income person, more expensive housing is affordable to you as a household, right? So sometimes we talk about affordable housing, and we just mean housing that is affordable to that household, and that's really dependent on the income of the household. But I think for this task force, for this working group, when we're talking about affordable housing, we're really talking about housing that is affordable to folks at or below the area's median income. And there's a whole lot of detail one could go into about this and what types of in certain housing programs are eligible to different populations based on their income, whether it's federally funded or state funded. We are not doing that as part of this, but really it means any housing that's affordable to people at the area median income or below. Sometimes folks, again, talk about these things differently. Sometimes people will use the term workforce housing. Some people use that term, not all, but some people use that term to really mean folks who are maybe between 80% and 120% of the area median income, or 100 and 120% of the area median income. It's not a specifically defined term. A lot of folks who are at or below 80% of area median income are also members of the workforce. And so I just think that as we are talking about what we want to talk about in the subcommittee, that if anyone has any questions about what someone means when they're talking about affordable housing or workforce housing, just ask, because we all use these terms a little bit differently. And so I just ask that as we're having these conversations, either ask what someone means if you don't know, or make sure that when you're talking about it, you're being clear about what you mean. That would be really helpful. The next is subsidized housing. And so the reason that this is going to be probably a large part of what we talk about in this group is that for housing to be affordable to a lot of the populations that we are specifically charged with talking about housing solutions for, oftentimes requires there to be a subsidy involved for those folks to be able to afford that housing. And so housing can be subsidized on the front end, right? So the government, whether it's federal government, state government, local government, is somehow providing funding to make that housing affordable to people of lower incomes. It can be, the subsidy can happen on the front end, right? So where money is being put into the process of developing, rehabilitating housing to make it be more affordable on the back end, right? So that the person creating the unit can either sell it, rent it, whatever they're doing with it, at a lower cost. Or the subsidy can really be on the back end, more of an operating subsidy, right? So that's where you have your things like vouchers that come through the public housing authorities, or just any type of rental assistance that's subsidizing, making it possible for that person to afford the rent on the other side, right? So subsidized housing doesn't all just mean public housing. It doesn't just mean vouchers. When we talk about subsidized housing, it can mean a lot of different, it can mean any of these things, depending on where the subsidy is. I put a note at the bottom, not all affordable housing is subsidized. Not all subsidized housing is affordable for everyone. Just something to keep in mind. Again, I'm doing this so that we can all be clear about what we're talking about, use similar language, or if we're not using similar language, that we're at least defining how we're using it, right? So like, there is housing in the community that is lower cost, rental housing, for example, that's lower cost, that's not subsidized. Oftentimes it's older, may not be in great condition, but it may ultimately be affordable, even though it's not subsidized. And then some housing that is subsidized isn't affordable for folks who have the lowest incomes, even though it has been subsidized in some way. And so that's what should be subsidized housing. And then the last piece is supportive housing. And so I think it's important that we share at least a similar definition of this as we go forward. Rental housing that is subsidized to be affordable for people with very low incomes is generally what is meant when we talk about supportive housing. So there's a subsidy involved that makes it affordable for people with very low incomes. Importantly, it's not supportive housing without supports, right? So supportive housing, the supports need to be there for it to be considered supportive housing. And usually supportive housing is targeted to people with disabling conditions or histories of homelessness. And the support services that are provided can be as intensive as they need to be to help people stabilize in those units, and are really focused on stabilizing people in housing. The services provided should, in supportive housing, be tailored to meet the needs of residents that are in those units. So some people may need really intensive supports all the time. Some people might need intensive supports for a short period of time and then lighter touch going forward. People's needs are different. And so the supportive services component of supportive housing is a really important part. And that is it for my general definitions. Do folks have questions or concerns about how those were presented, different thoughts or ideas that you want to share on those concepts before we move on? Any big ideas that you think we missed?
I'll add one thing.
Yes, please.
So, DSHA prepared a statewide housing needs assessment in 2023, and our consultant, Root Policy Research, who did the study on our behalf, included a definition of workforce housing in the glossary for the report. And I just want to share what that definition is, because again, as Rachel mentioned, there is no one definition that everybody industry-wide uses. But the definition that's in our needs assessment is workforce housing is housing that is affordable to households making up to 100% AMI, and that meets the needs of wage and service industry workers. And I think that second part of the definition is really critical, because a lot of our minimum wage workers and our service industry workers make significantly less than 100% AMI. So when people talk about workforce development projects, we need to know which part of the workforce, which occupations are we targeting, and what is their AMI level, what would be affordable for them. So I just wanted to share that. I see, Ed, your hand is raised.
Sure, thank you. One point to bring up, dealing with housing and persons with disabilities. One very limiting factor for people are the SSI limits. The asset limit is $2,000 in Delaware, hasn't been increased since the 1980s. And there are a number of states, both blue and red, that have begun to increase those asset limits, some of them appreciably. And I could send that data to you
Please.
after the meeting. The other, let me just give myself a note. The other limit is the income limit, where persons with disabilities to be on Medicaid are restricted to how much income they could have. And on top of all this, just to point this out, there is a drastic in Delaware and every other state, drastic shortage of support workers, severe. For example, for persons with developmental and intellectual disabilities, either the end of 23 or 24, early 24, the state increased the salaries of those caregivers to $15 per hour, increased it to $15 per hour. And this is a problem hitting every state. So those are factors also which need to be taken into account for that community.
Thank you, Ed. Just one quick follow-up question to what you said about the SSI asset limit. That's the limit to getting SSI, right? You're talking about getting access to SSI, or were you talking about getting access to housing for people? You're talking about getting access to SSI, correct?
People, I'm talking about people with disabilities. Okay, so that community. for them to be on Medicaid disability support, they have income and asset limits set federally, except states have the option to change it. And just something that occurred to me, one of the reasons perhaps that we haven't increased it is we don't have a sales tax. So for most people on SSI, they won't have that much savings anyway. So they will put whatever they have, or most whatever they have, into the economy. So I think not having a sales tax sort of blurs that for us.
Thank you. Anything else on the definitions or around affordable subsidized supportive housing that folks think were missed or want to share before we move on?
And Portia, feel free to jump in. I can't see our attendee list in screen share mode, so just chime in as you see fit.
Okay. Caitlin, if you want to go ahead and move on to talking about the charge, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. So the Affordable Housing Production Task Force is charged with making findings and recommendations on how both the state of Delaware and local governments can promote the production of rental units and homes that are affordable to people at various income levels throughout Delaware. And this charge is a direct reflection of the findings of DSHA's 2023 Housing Needs Assessment, which I already mentioned. We learned through that assessment that statewide, we have a shortage of 19,400 rental units that would be priced to be affordable to households making between 0 and 50% of area median income. We also know from the study that we have down renting happening, which is where our highest income renters, those who are making more than 120% AMI, are basically renting units that are much cheaper than what they can afford without being cost burdened. And so that creates scarcity for everybody else down the income ladder. So it just puts a downward pressure, which again, we see with the shortage at the lowest end of our AMI spectrum. We also know from the HNA that the for sale supply of homes in Delaware is unaffordable for pretty much anybody up until you're making more than 120% of area median income. Specifically, in 2022, 80% of the homes that were for sale in Delaware were only affordable to buyers making more than 120% AMI. So if you were making less than 120% AMI and you were looking to buy in 2022, you had very few options that were affordable to you. So again, those data points really informed the task force charge. There are some more specific things that we are directed to look at. So we're supposed to consider best practices related to land use, affordable housing production, and financing. Looking to what's happening in other states and jurisdictions. We're supposed to review zoning and permitting laws and regulations that govern residential land use and enable how well they either produce or inhibit the production of affordable housing, and study land use development and residential housing construction practices to determine what factors are limiting production here in Delaware. So that's the charge of the larger task force, which is currently made up of 19 members, including our chair. But then we also have 5 subcommittees, and each subcommittee has its own specific charge that's sort of layered on top of this larger focus on production. This right here shows the task force timeline. So the full task force has already met twice, and the meeting recordings for both of those meetings are available on DSHA's website. And now we are right here. So beginning this week and going into December, all 5 of our subcommittees are going to be meeting once per month to dig into those specific topics. And then the goal is in January to reconvene the full task force and have the subcommittees report out with their preliminary recommendations. We're probably going to schedule at least a 4-hour meeting for that January meeting, because we're gonna have 5 subcommittees, multiple recommendations per subcommittee, and it's gonna take a lot of time. Based on any feedback that the full task force shares at that meeting, subcommittees will then have an opportunity to meet one more time to clean up their recommendations. And then we'll be back in February with the full task force to hopefully vote on final recommendations. And then we are due to submit our final report to the governor and the General Assembly by March 1st of 2025. I know that's a really aggressive timeline, but Montana did it. And I feel like if Montana can do it, we can do it. The legislation also dictates sort of how we're supposed to approach our task force charge. So we're trying to look at it methodically, where we're identifying challenges and barriers to increasing supply. Then based off of those barriers, try to come up with potential solutions, and then prioritize recommendations that we think have legs. And for each recommendation that we come up with, we need to indicate who is supposed to implement it, right? So is this something that the state of Delaware needs to do? If so, is that the General Assembly that we're talking about? Or is it a state agency? Is this something a local government should implement? Or is it something that the private sector should be doing? And then in addition, will that recommendation require legislation? Will it require regulatory change? Or will it require funding subsidies? And I'm fully expecting that there should be a lot of recommendations that mention more funding. Okay, so this is our community focus group subcommittee. The legislation requires that we have certain stakeholders represented. So those include individuals over the age of 55, individuals with disabilities, veterans, victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, behavioral health and substance use disorder counselors, and cost burden residents. And when we say cost burden, we mean people who are paying more than 30% of their gross income on housing costs. If you exceed that 30% threshold, at that point, your housing is not affordable. And I'm happy to say that we do have representation from all of these different industries on our subcommittee. A couple of our members are not here today, but for example, Sheila Grant from AARP Delaware is going to be representing individuals over 55. Mr. Patrice Gibbs from the Delaware Center for Homeless Veterans is going to represent the veterans community. Nick Beard with the Delaware Coalition Against Domestic Violence will be representing victims of violence, and Karen Records from the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health will be representing behavioral health and substance use disorder counselors. So that's who we have to have on our subcommittee. We are also required by the legislation to review supportive services that are needed by the populations that we're representing, and what are the barriers for those populations to access housing. So this next slide is how we would like to sort of marry the larger task force charge and the specific topics that our subcommittee is supposed to consider. And so we've come up with 3 questions to sort of guide the work of our members. So the first question is, what recommendations can we make to ensure that our populations can access future housing production? What recommendations can we make to ensure that supportive services accompany future units that are produced? And what recommendations can we make to ensure that new units are produced to not only be affordable to our populations, but also accessible? And I mean accessible in multiple contexts, meaning is it physically accessible? But also, is there an easy way to find out about these housing opportunities? Where do you go to look for it? How do you know where to look for those opportunities? So turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. So help? Yep, okay. Sorry, just checking on timing for the meeting. So, what I was hoping to do is have some conversation about each one of these, maybe for about, 5 to 7 minutes each, with the rest of our time, about each one of these questions as a committee, or maybe a little less. But to really have you all of us who are members of the committee, to go back and bring to number 2. So this is actually number 4 on the agenda. Homework for meeting 2 is that we will all be talking to our folks in the community. We can even talk with each other, right?
Yes.
And talk with each other. And come back to the second meeting, bringing your own recommendations that fall under these 3 questions. And then bring those to the second meeting, and then the bulk of our second meeting will be really talking through those, so that by the time we have our third meeting, so going back to Caitlin's our timeline, so by the third meeting, we all can come to some kind of consensus about what recommendations we want to send to the task force in January. And our third, so we're going to have a meeting this month, one in November, one in December. So in our December meeting, we want to be able to be clear about what we're bringing to the full task force in January. Do members of this committee what do you think about these questions? Do they make sense to you? Just reflections on these questions as a guide for our work. Taking into account, of course, the charge of the task force overall, which is related to affordable housing production and access to affordable housing for these populations, which is what our committee is supposed to look at. Reflections? Does that make sense to folks?
It makes sense to me, but we talked
Yes,
about this
exactly.
already. But I do want to share something that I've been thinking about. And that is, we know that there are certain populations who are not served by the private rental market, right? Landlords can look at evictions, they can look at criminal history, they can look at credit scores, etc. And so there are people who, because of their criminal background, because of their credit, because of their eviction history, are never going to be approved to move into a unit. And so what I think about is, if we're not going to require that the private market serve everybody, then it necessarily falls to the other sectors to pick up the slack, right? The public sector and the nonprofit sector. And so I've been thinking a lot about, can we make recommendations about prioritizing housing access that is subsidized by the government, prioritize those opportunities for the people who are not served by that market. I'm thinking particularly of people who have a criminal history, and maybe they recently got out of the Department of Correction. They're going to have a really hard time finding housing. And so one thing I would like to offer for other people to mull over is, can we make some sort of recommendation about creating maybe project-based rental units, and then prioritizing the folks that we know don't really have a chance on the private unsubsidized rental market. So that's just one sort of idea to hopefully maybe get people to start thinking. And I know, Ed, your hand is up, and also Sarah. Ed, you're muted.
Is there a part of the overall committee, not our committee, looking at what other states have done?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of built into every subcommittee, is
Okay.
what other states are doing, because if there's a great idea that we can adapt, like why recreate the wheel?
Okay.
Yeah, so I think part of, and Ed, I know that you had shared with me the last week or so, and I haven't had a chance to really dig into it. I apologize for that. But some materials related, I think, to what some other places have been doing regarding housing and services for people with disabilities. And so I think part of what, as you're thinking about what you bring back to meeting number 2, if some of that are this is what happened in Pennsylvania, this is what happened in Montana. that has worked really well, and you want to have this committee think about one of those recommendations, please bring them to meeting number 2.
Sarah?
Two things. First, sorry, I'll shout. First, it would be really helpful if we could have a shared document prior to meeting number 2 that was formatted in a way that we could all kind of see what we are sharing. I think if we come to meeting number 2 with a lot of free flow ideas, we will be less able to prioritize as a group. So I would ask for that for
On it.
sharing. Thank
We're
you.
on. Great idea,
Um,
Sarah.
Taking notes.
Also, in reflection to Caitlin's comment, I think one of the concerning trends that is nationwide and also we're seeing in Delaware is the removal of public housing units from our housing stock. And so I think the population that you're talking about, Caitlin, the folks that need the most assistance, both in supportive services and also access to, deeply affordable housing. This is a really concerning trend. There are a number of public housing complexes that have gone to LIHTC funding and displaced large numbers of residents that are elderly or disabled or have disabling conditions or have other issues that make it difficult for them to enter the private rental market. But even with a subsidy, a federal subsidy such as LIHTC, they cannot remain in a federally subsidized housing complex. And so I think, if we're talking about the hardest to serve populations, we need to talk about the housing with the most supports. And that would be public housing paired with other supportive services as like kind of the gold standard of housing for people who need the most support.
Thank you for that. I think one of the things also to keep in mind about what the larger task force is going to talk probably a lot about low-income housing tax credit developments, because it is the primary mechanism by which new units are created in this country, like it or not at this point. And how do we increase funding for those developments to make more of them? Maybe that the states can contribute some, or that some funding is coming from somewhere else, we can produce more of them, which is great. This committee, I think, as you just said, a lot of those properties are never going to be, because they're operated by private property management companies. The income levels still don't reach down to the lowest income folks. It's really our charge to think about exactly what Sarah was just saying. Beyond that, what is needed to create that supportive housing where it's going to be definitely affordable to folks who maybe are only on SSI, and accessible to them given some of the barriers that are in place in other units.
And
So just to re-emphasize how important that point is, that does not need to be that's the focus of the large task group. But I think a large part of our role is to say, and these folks, and how do we make sure that, I think that's kind of to question number 1. What recommendations can we make to ensure that the populations we are most concerned about actually are getting access to whatever gets produced? And that's going to require different interventions, both from a funding perspective, regulatory perspective.
Yeah, and if I can follow up on that briefly, and then I'll put my hand down. I agree wholeheartedly. I think we should consider both the layered subsidies within the LIHTC housing, but also stepping outside of that housing. We see that LIHTC housing is often, even with like an 811 project-based subsidy that is supposed to be very accessible for individuals with disabilities, is often not as accessible as, say, a traditional public housing unit.
Oh, did I hit that button? I want to make sure we have plenty of time today for public comment. And so for the sake of time, I do want to, we're going to create a shared document. Thank you, Sarah. I want folks before our next meeting, we'll do some follow-up communications after this meeting with our members to make sure that folks have access to that document and can share their ideas in it. Please feel free to reach out to Caitlin or myself if you have any issues with that once we get that out. For the sake of time for today, making sure we have time for public comment, I do want to go, I like the next slide. I want to go to it. That's all right, Caitlin?
Yeah, sure.
So parking lot, I like the idea of having a parking lot. There's a lot we could talk about. And I want to make sure that even if it's not directly related to the charge of the committee, that we are documenting ideas that are good and come out of this group, that maybe aren't gonna end up necessarily going to the full task force, but that they get acknowledged as coming out of this committee as things that either need further explanation or needs to be addressed in the future. So I think as we are having these meetings, and maybe even in the document, we can create a parking lot section, where some of the ideas that maybe don't necessarily fit exactly within the charge of this committee can be captured, for the future. Does that sound okay to folks? Okay.
Right. I think that was the last slide, yeah. Okay. Right. Let's see. So are we gonna move to public comment?
Is there anything else related to our next steps or our charge from the committee members before we open public comment? Okay, then yes, let's say yes.
All right, so our meeting is until 4 p.m. Typically we do 2 minutes, but I feel like we have a lot more time. Looking at how many attendees are on here. So if it's okay with you, I'm not gonna cut people off.
I'm totally okay with that.
All right, great. So at this point, if you are an attendee and would like to share a public comment, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. Okay, so first up we have Lisa Rice. So Lisa, you should be able to speak now. I see that you've unmuted, Lisa, but there's not any sound coming through. We're still not hearing anything. If you'd like to maybe try to jump out of the Zoom webinar and hop back on and see if that works. But you can also email your comments to me at housing.taskforce@delaware.gov. Okay. Is there anybody else in Zoom land who would like to share public comment? We have a quiet group today. That is surprising. Yeah.
So if no one else is gonna talk, can we talk more about our vision for supportive services?
Yeah, if there isn't gonna be a lot of, let me ask a question real quick, Caitlin.
Yeah.
We move away from public comment, sorry, this is just about procedure in a
Sure.
public task force setting. If we move away from public comment, can we come back to it if
Sure.
folks change their mind and raise their hands?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So we're gonna close public comment for the time being and go back to committee members.
All right, but we will circle back. And Lisa, again, if you want to try to jump off and jump back on, see if that fixes the audio, that'd be great. Thank you. All right, Sarah.
Yeah, so I feel like we did a good job of kind of starting to brainstorm on where our committee should focus in the context of the larger task force around production of units. I suspect that we may be the only committee that takes a dive in a meaningful way into supportive services, and I think that's a really fundamental part of the accessibility piece that we are tasked with. I'm so glad Ed is here because he's one of my favorite people when we talk about supportive services. So I think on our shared document, I would love to see kind of different categories of supportive services and what our ideals would be for those services. We know that this is a huge ask and a huge lift, but I feel like there are lots of systems outside of housing that are necessary for folks to have success in housing. And so by that, I mean supportive case management services, including health, substance abuse, mental health, job training and education, family support, so childcare, and other, family needs, education needs for children, busing, transportation, like all of the, I'm just listing things and I don't have a list in front of me, but all of the supports that are necessary for someone to have success within their housing. I think that other jurisdictions who've looked at like very intensive housing first models or models that have like very intensive wraparound services is one place that we need to look. But I think in general, and I'm saying this understanding that we're all doing our best, but the lack of accessibility for all of these services generally in Delaware creates a lack of accessible housing as well, right? So if you're not receiving the mental health services that you need, you will not be able to gain and maintain housing. Or if you cannot access the case management you need, you may not be able to gain and maintain housing. So I'm talking both about like super intensive wraparound supportive services for the most difficult to serve population, but also just in general. And I think Ed touched on this a little bit in his comment, aid services. We see people who face eviction or face housing instability because the aid agency that's supposed to provide an aid, every day just stops coming for a while, right? And so that's a huge problem within our state. In addition, so just, I think this is a massive snowball of a conversation, and we didn't touch on it, and I would love to see us try and structure it when we talk about it online or in the next meeting.
So I like the categories you just use kind of like two categories, right? But it wasn't about specific service type, like you mentioned all the service types, but in my head I heard like two big, like intensive services and supportive housing, right? For the most vulnerable folks so that they can maintain their housing. You mentioned housing first, the housing first model, where the focus of that housing stabilization support is really about helping people maintain their tenancy and providing access to all kinds of services in the community. But if those services in the community aren't accessible, right? But then also outside of folks in supportive housing, people having access to the general types of supports that you would expect to receive, and not having them puts their housing at risk.
Correct.
Those two buckets.
Correct. So I think there are people who need very, very intensive wraparound services in order to gain and maintain housing. And then I think there are people who need some discrete services to gain and maintain housing, and both are lacking in Delaware.
Ed, would you like to?
Two things that come to mind. One is transportation. For persons to have a job, they need to be able to get from their home to their job on time and back home on time to take care of what they have to take care of at home. The other thing, and I will be proposing this shortly, so hold on, is many people need basic financial education, checking, saving, not being scammed online, and that kind of support is also will also be required.
Can I piggyback off of that? So we received a public comment following our first full task force meeting from a member of DCRAC. And they brought up the need for estate and will planning and guidance. There are a lot of issues that arise, unfortunately, where I think they refer to it as tangled titles, where, there might be a person and they own a home, but they don't have a will set up or an estate and they pass away. And then it's very difficult for, their children or their family members to then be able to, inherit that house. And so I just wanted to share that, that was brought up in public comment. And I think we want to make it a point, like with our parking lot, to make sure that we are acknowledging these things that people are bringing from the outside to our subcommittee.
Other reflections on services, right? So we have that, one of the 3 questions, did she ever hand back up?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay. Well, I want to make sure we finish discussion,
Okay.
and then we can go back to public comment.
Sure, okay.
Any other thoughts from committee members around the supportive services component? I know one of the things that I'll share, so I'm putting that question out there, but then I'm talking, so I'm sorry. I think one of the things that, as Sarah said, that we see a lot of is that housers are responsible for housing, services folks are responsible for services, but in order for vulnerable populations to be stably housed, those providers, entities need to come together and have a shared vision. And so I don't know if this is the committee that some type of recommendation like that would come out of, but I think having the housers and the service folks come up with a shared vision for how they're going to make sure those things come together. One of the things that I automatically think about is, I know, for example, Delaware gets a very, and so this is in the one bucket of intensive services for supportive housing that you brought up, Sarah. Delaware gets an allocation from the federal government, just like every state, from the National Housing Trust Fund. And it was a big deal 10 years ago or something, I don't know, made that up, 10, 15 years ago, when legislation happened at the federal level to create this National Housing Trust Fund. And then every state gets an allocation, and the charge for those funds is specifically about creating supportive housing for the populations that we're talking about. But I don't know, and so maybe this is more about education too, I don't know how much intentional partnership there is coming from DHSS, and I guess it comes through DSHA, to think about how to use those funds best and ensure that services are connected to whatever housing is produced that's appropriate for the population. That there's a real partnership there in those, the units that come out of that. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, a lot of people, and this is kind of going to funding too, but that is not a lot of money. I'm sure Michelle could answer potentially some of how this all works, but it's not a lot of money. And so but it's specifically for supportive housing. Is there a way that the state of Delaware could match the federal allocation on an annual basis so that that's more robust? Is there some type of recommendation we could make that for every unit produced with the housing trust fund money of supportive housing for these populations, that there's some type of service dollar allocation to those projects to ensure that services accompany the production? So just kind of putting that out there too, because that's something I've been thinking a lot about before coming into this meeting. And again, the services have to be there for it to work.
Do you want me to shift to public comment now?
If there isn't anything else from panelists, not panelists, sorry, I'm saying panelists because I'm looking up at the screen, members of the committee, services. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, see if Lisa.
All right, so we're gonna go back to public comment. We're gonna try this again. So Lisa, you should be able to unmute at this point.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I wanted to say today that community is everything right now in federal funding, in investor funding, CDFIs. The housing projects, when I read into the policies of different funding opportunities that I shared earlier, in each one of them, you have to serve the community as a whole, because each population that's been underserved for hundreds of years, they don't want to just all be lumped together. They just want to live as people in the community. And for the first time, the federal government agrees and is funding it. And for families with developmental disabilities like mine, it's shocking. And we want to pounce on it while it's still here, because federal funding comes in waves. We don't feel like they're going to focus on this forever. And for low income families and for English learners. The food related projects that were shared earlier for communities in Delaware, they, not only for obvious reasons, bringing fresh fruit and vegetables to underserved communities, but they would also bring in USDA funding and US aid. The food-related projects attract US aid, and they will facilitate and manage federal grants. And we did, I'm sorry, you guys mentioned getting access to financial literacy and mental health, and that's definitely in the federal funding that I found, especially financial literacy. Here in Delaware, I spoke to Tom Lindia with Morgan Stanley, and he didn't officially agree, but was interested and was interested in speaking more about it. Black Diamond Wealth. There's a representative from Black Diamond Wealth that said the same thing. They would be interested in providing this. Developers, one in particular mentioned that if we could figure out how to have higher density, then we solve the problem. And through research, I discovered that the ticket to higher density is inclusive housing. Apparently, it's, for lack of better words, I'm sorry, it's easier. Inclusive housing does not mean disabled. Inclusive housing means everyone, and everyone just has a sense of belonging. Mentioning caregiver training, that is one of the 3 largest complaints in history for housing with disabilities, is nutrition, placement, and caregiver training, sorry for lack of better word again. And for me, what that looks like in Delaware is mindfulness. And there's also Project Impact, autism training.
Thank you,
We
Lisa.
do have a team of businesses in Delaware that are willing to expand and serve the populations in the housing projects that we're talking about, everyone. I found over 1,400 case study analysis that showed the effects of music, art, equine assisted therapies and programs, recreational programs, and outdoor learning on child development, literacy, math, mental health, family relations, academics, autism, ADHD, ODD, and well-being. So we don't have tons of art and music therapists in Delaware. We have some that are willing to expand and hire people for economic development reasons to serve these populations. I'll include the names in a document much neater for you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see, Cheyenne, you're up next. And again, we're not timing folks because we have a small group and plenty of time.
I was just thinking about the questions about like the populations of people that have like a criminal background, bad credit, and would this group be recommending some law changes around like, you know, hey, like maybe you can get that, you know, that eviction taken off of your credit history, you know, in a year or two type of thing. Or even something around rent control to say, hey, like, since we're going to have to rely on just the open market of places, can we make sure that we're, you know, addressing the fact that rent is still going up and we need to limit it? I guess I'm thinking in general of things that are not necessarily going to be fully about production, but will be about access, or would all that fall into the realm of like a, you know, basically a parking lot thing? And then the other thought is, does affordable housing production include the production of like permanent shelters or anything like that, or places where people are able to essentially stay and come out of homelessness? And how do we kind of incorporate those like needs of people who are experiencing homelessness into this conversation about like, you know, making more affordable housing? Because, you know, obviously there's just different cases when we talk about people who've been doing it, like living out in the streets for a long time. So just a couple of questions.
You want to try to answer them or?
I can try to answer them. So I think the quick answer to your question is we don't yet know what this committee is going to recommend. That's what we're going to work through at the next two meetings. All the task force subcommittees and the task force have the ability to make recommendations related to legislative changes, funding, and regulatory changes. And some of what you just mentioned could fall under those things. I do think that the goal, like part of my vision, and I want to make sure that the recommendations that come out of the subcommittee get ultimately adopted by the task force. And so I do want to make sure that they are in some way related to the overall task force's goal of production and new units, or not always newly produced units, rehab, et cetera, but I do want to make sure that the line from between what this committee recommends and the task force's charge can be drawn clearly for folks, for whatever we do bring to them, so that the larger committee is likely to adopt and recommend. In terms of what those end up being, we don't know yet. So I think that's a question, you know, those specific topics are a question. I don't know if that's helpful or not, Cheyenne. That's where I see it. I think that's why we have the three questions that Caitlin and I kind of came up with to guide our discussion. Some of those things can fit in there. Can we draw a direct line between those things and the charge of the task force? I think are up for discussion.
Yeah, so like my 2 cents, and thank you, Cheyenne, for those questions. Like I, in my mind, can draw a pretty straight line from sealing eviction records to, you know, being able to access newly produced units for our population. So in my mind, I think there's at least one yes among the questions that you asked. Michelle?
Yes, hello, everyone. I wanted to go back in reference to what Rachel had mentioned regarding supportive housing and the HTF. And one thing that I did want to say, since I believe it was 2016, DSHA had in our QAP for LIHTC the option to check off for supportive housing units and to be able to get additional credits. Unfortunately, there has not really been any success with that. I can tell you that at this point in time, DSHA does have a partnership with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH. And we are working with them to hopefully develop a blueprint, if you will, to furthering those partnerships and to be able to get those supportive services lined up, because that is really what we need to make supportive housing work. You know, DSHA has the ability to help with bricks and mortar construction, but obviously we can't provide those wraparound services. So the partnerships that Rachel was mentioning as far as DHSS, that's extremely critical.
Thank you, Michelle. Quick follow-up question. In terms of your work with CSH, is there like a time frame for, are there going to be recommendations that come out of that, or is it just kind of an internal, like, we're going to change how we do X, Y, and Z in order to, like, what is the, I guess, the product, and is there a timeline on the product? If that makes sense.
No timeline yet. We are, we've recently met with individuals at DHSS to lay out our hopes and our goals. And so we are still a little bit in the beginning stages, although DSHA has worked with CSH in the past, for example, back when SRAP was being developed. So we are familiar with CSH, they are familiar with us. They also looked at a Medicaid crosswalk on how to incorporate Medicaid, and we're trying to utilize all of that data to move forward with this blueprint.
Gotcha. So now I just have one more follow-up question based on what you just said. So the blueprint is intended to be a blueprint for how DHSS and DSHA can partner to create more supportive housing units broadly. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yes.
That's great to hear.
And gives us a lot to think about as we anticipate our next governor's administration, right? It's going to be really important for the director of DSHA and the director of DHSS to buy into this type of partnership. Right.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to ask if there were any other folks that wanted to provide public comment. So just because we have a few more minutes, I do want to, I've been thinking about one of the things Cheyenne said about creating more temporary housing for folks, or temporary shelter for folks. I don't think it's out of the scope of this committee to be talking about temporary housing as something that's needed in the short term. I think there's some really cool ideas that aren't really necessarily as simple as like creating more shelter, about how to do that potentially utilizes existing units and resources. So as an example, this is just one small thing, but like Newcastle County recently passed an ordinance to promote and try to promote the redevelopment of like empty office buildings into potential housing, some of which could be affordable under their inclusionary zoning. Could there be, so that makes me think, like, could there be opportunities about like using some existing properties to create temporary safe places for people to live while the affordable housing production is happening? What types of resources would be needed to do that? I think if there already are, I think the way that that type of recommendation could be received by the whole task force would be if there are already resources or like samples. That we don't have to like create something out of nothing, like, so this is one of the things that I'm thinking about, with Alice. Maybe I should talk to Alice first, but like, so for example, the jurisdictions, like DSHA is only one, Newcastle County and I think Wilmington also have like home funding, home ARP funding that is federal funding, and the federal government is specifically saying like, we want this funding to be used to create temporary and permanent safe, affordable units for people experiencing homelessness. And we are strongly encouraging you to use them to do things like what they did with the Hope Center around taking an empty old hotel. Maybe it's not empty, maybe the person's just selling, taking a hotel and turning into either permanent and supportive housing, or temporary interim housing. So I think some of those resources have not yet been allocated in Delaware and will be in the next like 6 to 9 months. So that may be a way to like make a recommendation of, hey, we know these federal resources are coming. We want to make a recommendation that they be used for this population or something like that. So just her comment made me think about that. And that I think ties that type of recommendation to funding, to regulatory changes. Just wanted to share.
Yeah. I also thought of home ARP when Cheyenne asked about emergency shelters. So for my part, I'm happy to reach out to our colleagues in our housing development section to get an update on our draft allocation plan and what that looks like. So I can come to meeting 2 with an update on that.
Is that something that all the jurisdictions should have by now, or is like in process? Because I think it would be like, again, I don't know if like Wilmington and Newcastle already have allocation plans and have already put the money out or not, or if this is something we should even tackle because it's on the state level. I don't know.
So I'm on Newcastle County's website right now. They do have a final draft of their home ARP allocation plan.
How did you just do that? You're like a really good multitasker. Very good multitasking.
Yeah, and I know the city of Wilmington also received its own separate allocation. So I think in the state of Delaware, it's the 3 of us. I think it's city of Wilmington has its own, Newcastle County has its own, and then DSHA, basically our allocation will benefit the balance of the state. So Kent and Sussex counties. But I'm not sure, you know, I am not aware of any of us actually having already done anything with the funds. And I want to say that there might have been some questions at the federal level about, you know, how we actually do this, what's allowable. And so that's
like brand new.
It is,
right?
This is the first time we've ever had this funding source. And so, you know, my homework on top of the shared document will be trying to get an update just for folks' own edification at our next meeting.
Thank you, Caitlin. I thought I saw Portia. I think I saw you raise your hand. Did I miss that?
You did. I have been having so many technical difficulties, so I apologize. That is why I have not been able to comment thus far. I do believe that several of the members that are on the meeting's comments were very important. I'm thinking specifically to Cheyenne's comment when she specifically talked about how to make housing available now. I think in previous committee meetings, they've talked about regulations and production, which we all know can take time. I really strongly hope that one of our focus as the community focus group is how to make that timeline short, because we know the people that need housing now. So producing housing that will become available 3, 4, 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line is great, but also keeping in mind what we can do right now to make that housing available should be a focus of ours.
Thank you, Portia.
Okay, Cheyenne? Yep, you can still talk.
Okay, I was gonna ask another separate question from the stuff, which I appreciate you guys answering, is in the last subcommittee meeting with Finance Committee, one of the things that came up, I was hoping would also come up here too. So it was about this idea of concentrated poverty and how there are sometimes regulations placed on, funds that come from either the state or from the feds that say you can only have so many affordable units when you're building using certain types of funds. And so like 30% affordable units and the rest have to be market rate. And like, I'm really worried about this idea of like, we should not be concentrating poverty, and how like there's a lot of like racial undertones, class undertones to that makes me worry. I actually think that it would be really good for this committee to consider how to address some of the research behind this idea of concentrating poverty and saying that we don't want all this affordable housing in certain areas, not just because like there's a lot of barriers to what happens when we have to like, put affordable housing in places that don't have infrastructure to carry it, but also just because like I said, there's a lot of racism behind that idea that we're quote unquote concentrating poverty. So I just hope that that's something that this group can like talk through and think through and see like, how do we solve this without there being these crazy restrictions where we're bringing in all this money, but then only 30% of the units that we're creating can actually be affordable. The rest are market rate. Like there's some scary stuff going on there.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting you raised that point. When we were doing our stakeholder feedback process for the housing needs assessment, I remember a stakeholder bringing up the fact that deconcentrating poverty shouldn't always be our number one goal, that sometimes it's more important to maintain your support network where you are. And so if that means remaining in an area that already has concentrated poverty, but you have a support network, maybe that's better than moving to a higher income area where you don't have those supports. So I just wanted to make that connection that, this is feedback we've heard before. I thank you for sharing it.
Well, yeah, and I do think there's been a lot of tension probably over the last like 6 years, but about that idea of like, did it go too far in the other direction? And that's part of why we're not producing enough units, right? Like we're refusing to build in places where there's land that's available and cheap. We're refusing to create enough units that are actually needed. Like the whole Hope 6 redevelopment project by HUD was all about taking public housing units, creating mixed income units, which then ultimately decreased the number of affordable housing units that were available in the community. They created mixed income communities, which is a positive thing, but ultimately the number of affordable units went down. And so when we're thinking, so thank you for bringing up that point. I mean, there's a lot of tension between like those ideas.
Yeah.
And sometimes the goals of housing development and the need don't always.
Yeah, so DSHA, we have our QAP, that's our Qualified Allocation Plan, and that is basically a document for developers that want to apply to get tax credits to create affordable rental housing. And we incentivize our prospective developers to do projects in what we call areas of opportunity. These are places where there's really high school proficiency rates, really good access to jobs and amenities, et cetera. And we don't see that many LIHTC proposals in areas of opportunity. Generally, we do see them in areas where there already is a lot of affordable and subsidized housing. And I had always thought that the rationale for trying to deconcentrate poverty had to do with like tax-based implications and how that affects like school funding. And so I always thought that that was the reason why we wanted to not concentrate poverty, but surely, you mentioned racial undertones, like it would be very interesting to see the research related to that and to disentangle those things.
Like Rachel said, I think it's something that's been a political pendulum that has been very much, yeah. And Cheyenne, I couldn't agree more that we need to think about it through certainly a DEI lens as well. But like I said earlier, I think, like Rachel said, this policy has created less of those desirable, affordable units for people, whether or not they're in good or bad or whatever areas that we're not seeing the same production rates.
Yes, those were great points, Cheyenne.
Are there any other folks who would like to provide any public comment or reactions from any committee members?
Oh, okay,
Kata.
Kata Dorsey.
Hi,
Ada, you-
everyone. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm not unable to put my camera on. But I just wanted to make sure that we were keeping in mind our newcomers in this conversation, our immigrant populations, because they are also going through this housing issues. And I don't think that we put enough emphasis on newcomers coming to Delaware, not understanding how to navigate this housing situation and understanding what affordable is. I just wanted to put some emphasis on that. I just wanted to make sure that that was a part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kata. Lillian.
Hi, kind of in reference to the comment about like where we're building houses, the mixed use developments and putting them in areas that are already designated zones. Hopefully we will talk about the fact that especially in Sussex County, the areas where you can build are not incentivized zones. So the areas where you're going to get the incentives are the areas that are already being built. So when these programs come about and you're doing mixed use developments or they're turning into mixed use developments because they're already near schools and they're already near transportation and things like that, that helps to significantly decrease the production of affordable housing when the areas that we could get land cheaper, we could build cheaper, are not incentivized zones. The housing price to develop housing hasn't gone down. It's still pretty high to just develop housing. But if we could at least get areas or land that are incentivized, it gives us an opportunity to then consider at least breaking even when you're starting to develop housing. And we talked a little bit about in one of our committees, the zoning where they have level 1 and level 2 zones, which are more incentivized for building housing, even affordable housing. But the cost of housing and the fact that they're oversaturated because people are already building there leaves all these other areas that are probably ripe for building just not even a consideration because they're not incentivized. Some not at all.
Thank you, Lillian.
For other hands. Okay, we have 9 minutes left.
If there isn't anything else, I'd be happy to give folks 9 minutes back in their afternoon. All right, well, thank you all so much for coming today. Is there anything special we need to do, Caitlin, to close the meeting?
Nothing special. I was just going to read off our next meeting date. So I'm pulling that up because I have not memorized the dates. Bear with me a moment. Okay, so our next meeting is going to be on November 14th at 1 p.m. The in-person location is going to be the Hazlitt Armory, which is off of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Dover. But we will also have the hybrid Zoom option, so folks can also attend that way. And if you do plan on attending virtually, there is a registration link on the public meeting calendar and on the General Assembly's website. And you should also have, all of our subcommittee members should have calendar invites with this information as well. I did see one hand pop up for Kata.
Yes, I was just wondering where it's listed of everyone who is on on the task force and the committee members?
Yep, so all of that information is listed on DE statehousing.com/about/housing-production-task you know what, I'm just gonna ask Michelle if she can drop the link into the chat. I
That
cannot
would be
use.
great. That would be great.
Yeah, so all membership information, meeting dates, meeting recordings, slides, all of that is accessible from that webpage. So if Michelle can just, do we even have a chat? We don't have a chat. It will be emailed. So, Kata, I will make sure that if you're not already on our mailing list, you are on our mailing list, and I'll have a reminder sent out to folks with that link.
Thank
And
you.
also, it's also just fairly easily Googleable. Delaware State Housing, and then just put in like task force, and it's easy to find that way too. Yeah. You don't have to think about all the slashes.
Yeah, too many slashes.
Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.